Hello, and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. Chats on leadership, life, and lessons learned, often the hard way. Today, Bobby and Bridge are talking about emotional intelligence. Oh my god, what a wide topic. Where the heck do we start? But start we will. Come and join us for being a full EQ. Hello.
Hi, Bobby.
How is one's emotions today?
Yeah, actually, I'm feeling pretty balanced, regulated, however I want to describe it. I went to a woo woo with wine last night, which was fun, doing some learning all about, not reflexology, what's the one with smells? Aromatherapy.
I was going to call it odology because I had no idea what you were talking about.
Aromatherapy. So yes, I've been doing aromatherapy. So I'm all sort of zenned out on that. I've recently done some somatic. I do a somatic breathing, which involved a lot of screaming. I think that the facilitator was ever so slightly disturbed by the amount of screaming I did. I think people around me were also ever so slightly disturbed by the screaming that I was doing, and I had a sore throat for 2 days afterwards. Yeah. So anyway, I'm trying to be a little bit more emotionally regulated, getting sleep, etc. But in terms of it's 4 elements of EQ, according to Goleman, who is the godfather, not the father, but the godfather of EQ. Yeah, I had an interesting sort of think about how I perform on EQ. I think I'm good at some bits, but maybe not all of them.
Do you want to even go down that route first? Because one, that will introduce the Godfather's Matrix. And equally, I think a good way into this is talking about our own relationship with our developing, underdeveloping, or whatever it might be, EQ.
Well, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I suspect you did too. And so some of the stuff I came up with was maybe more controversial or going against some of the received wisdom in terms of EQ. But I think if we start off with sort of the beginning bit so that people can follow it, and if they're not familiar with some of the elements, then at least they can follow that, and then we can have sort of more of the discussion about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, or whether it's been co-opted as a corporate control, as some people have found. So what I came across was that it was first coined by the person who's now the president of Yale. I'm just trying to look up his name, and it's
I didn't come across
Salovey. I can't remember. I haven't got his first name, but a guy called Salovey. He basically coined the phrase about emotional intelligence, and then the Godfather, Goleman, took it on and sort of developed it even more. And I think there's a guy called Caruso. So it's Peter Salovey and Caruso developed this intelligence test, emotional intelligence test called Mesquite. And I thought, you know what, before we do this episode, I'm going to do the test, but you have to pay for it. So I was like, no, fuck off. That's how dedicated I am to this podcast. So fuck off. Anyway, Mr. Salovey developed this, and he said there were 4 components: perceiving emotions, using emotions, understanding emotions, and managing emotions. Those are the 4 elements. You can let me know if that aligns with what you've looked at or what you've come across.
Well, I think that may well have been where it started, and I didn't get back far enough because I went with the Godfather, Master Goldman, and his are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management.
Yeah.
So I think that they do align. I think it's all much of a muchness. But I think if we're agreeing that the 4 boxes that we're going to look at during this episode sort of like fit around those things that you're saying and I'm saying, then that's pretty cool to give some kind of map along with our continuum of bunny holes, which seem to be part and parcel of our podcast.
Well, I was interested because Goleman's come up a lot while I've been doing academic studies in leadership and management, and Goleman sort of came up in terms of one of these things, leaders, you need to be able to lead yourself first, manage your emotions, blah, blah, blah. And I came across an article that was about Goleman saying the 12 traits. And then as I read the article, it said self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management, and call me old-fashioned, that's 4. And please help me. Anyway, I'm going to send you the article. And if anyone else wants to read the article too, For the love of me, I can't find 12. I couldn't find 4. Unless maybe it divided then 3 elements into the 4, but I couldn't see that. Maybe I just was reading too fast or being a bit ADHD about the whole thing. But yeah, anyway, I found it a bit, it jarred in my brain because I was like, where are these 12 traits? And then I thought I'm going to have to read it again and again until I can identify the 12 traits. And no, I can't, because actually we're recording at 10:30, and so I'm going to have to stop now. So anyway, it made me anxious. That article made me anxious.
So here we are with your emotional quotient in practice as a result of researching for emotional intelligence. Excellent. I was going to say that does say something about the things that Daniel Goleman does come up with, though, because he talks about unperturbable, if that's a word, unperturbable.
What?
Perturbable. I can't. I think I'm trying to say unperturbable.
I think you're saying, yeah,
if that's a word. Attention. I might be putting extra thingamajiggies in, but yeah. Anyway, but it is that not distracted attention, and I think that you going, but they said 12 states. I want 12 states. Where are they? Was preventing you from being in the flow state that he talks about. That's what I was trying to say, but making a real hash of it.
Yeah, and actually we may get to this challenging element of EQ earlier than I thought. So I'm currently a big fan of, I'm going to call him Reverend Adam Grant, because we've got Saint Brené and we've got Sir Simon Sinek. So it's going to be Reverend Adam Grant, or Bishop. I don't know how else can we, Prime Minister, Emperor. Anyway, looking at Adam Grant, and he's got some really great podcasts on EI and challenging some of the received wisdom of EI. And through him, I came across, well, also an article in the New Yorker, but also one of his podcasts, which I think is Rethink. And he interviews Merve Emre, and she is not a fan of the concept of EI. And I think maybe she might be a bit like me in terms of that she gets that people have an ability on a spectrum of being able to deal with emotions, manage emotions, recognize emotions, all of those things, use emotions. But she doesn't like it being called emotional intelligence. So it's a bit like my thing about imposter syndrome, that I don't like the narrative that surrounds it, maybe. And so therefore I kind of push against it. So she has this reaction to Goleman's work in terms of that it seems, in a way, he attributes low emotional intelligence with a lack of morality to an extent. He conflates those. And actually then, when the majority of the examples he gives of people with low emotional intelligence are actually people who are obviously having mental health breakdowns. And so she says actually that there's a failure in his suggestion that being able to hold on to your emotions, to be able to not be perturbable, or to be imperturbable or unperturbable, not sure which one is somehow a bad thing. And yet there are lots of other sociological elements that fill into that. She's saying, well, this worship of EQ just makes us biddable, and it's effectively saying that we should be biddable. And that he equates it to, going to school, doing well at school, holding down your emotions in a job so you don't challenge, getting married, holding marriages together, not getting divorced, having babies, and then bringing up your children in the same way, rinse and repeat. It's a fairly extreme sort of reaction to some of what he's saying. But she's saying that the message that comes out from a lot of EQ, EI, narrative now is effectively it's being co-opted into corporate control or societal control, criticizes people who aren't necessarily good at it without recognizing that there are all kinds of other elements that fall into it. It's a super interesting conversation, and the article is quite interesting as well, where Adam Grant sort of pushes back against some of what she's saying, but also agrees to an extent, because he basically says, in the pandemic, rather than firing abusive bosses, rather than dealing with micromanagement, actually what most organizations did was just say, hey, we're going to teach you how to deal with stress. So they effectively were saying, oh, we'll just help you increase your emotional intelligence, rather than go, let's actually deal with some of the reasons why people are being put under pressure. And so he was saying nobody was curing the sick culture, rather than just saying, oh, well, people need to just be able to manage their emotions better. He basically said, I think we should ban psychological solutions to organizational problems.
Wow. God.
That's my rabbit hole.
Yeah, no. So, and again, here we have real life or real time occurrences, because there was something else I read about going through 400 different emotional states in a day. I feel like I've gone through a number of those just listening to you, from fucking irritated at somebody for deciding to bash somebody else's work without any solution to it, is where I started from. And then I stopped myself from doing it and listened in a different state, which is about where you get to with your EQ. If we are to believe that there is something, and that's not you controlling it, that was me controlling it. And I think that that's where I'm at with it. It's not black and white. It's not just one element to it, because I read Goleman's work and I hear you, the examples that she's coming up with about a controlling influence of school, a controlling influence of society, a controlling influence of these are the things that get done as the social norms, whatever it might be, that aligns very much so in terms of the work that I do, where we all get shaped by stuff. There is our personality in things, there is our intelligence in things, and we get shaped by stuff. And I think it's the shaping stuff that then can, and again, I haven't done research, I'm no bloody professor or anything here, this is my understanding of it. But when you then actually put your emotional quotient into that, your emotional quotient will have been affected by your shaping. So I agree with her from that perspective. So that's one thing, if I'm hearing correctly what she said. And then the other thing that Goleman talks about is this business about what happens in our brain and in another person's brain with the mirror neurons, like our radar. And there's some article that I read where he's saying about, and I've done this as part of development training, where you do eye engagement with somebody, where you can, well, this sets me down a rabbit hole, where you can sit looking at somebody, eye gazing, and not speak to them for 2 minutes. And the person with the stronger emotional pull to create an impression can change the emotional makeup of another person. Now, where does that fit in emotional control? I'm suddenly going, ooh, maybe she was onto something from that perspective. And there's also been research done, and we've done these exercises, haven't we, where, a whole lot of faces are thrown up in front of you. And if you start watching another person, if you get a whole lot of faces of people getting grumpy and frowning, people start taking on the facial expressions. Whereas if you are welcomed and, have a set of faces that are smiling, eyes sparkling, etc., it changes your emotional makeup. Where am I going with this? There is the shaping, I absolutely agree, of what that does to us. And we also get shaped by others. We get shaped by situations, we get shaped by others. And then I think where he's going with it is, what is it that we can do for ourselves, and what is it that we have leaders needing to be doing, looking at the 4 quadrants. But then Adam Grant's quote is saying, stop trying to...
Well, I think that, just going back, I don't think she was disagreeing that emotions are powerful, that they can change things. Mm-hmm. It was the intelligence element that she objected to, particularly this sort of idea that comes from some of Goleman's earlier work that suggests that some people are better, i.e. better human beings, because they are able to suppress or manage or restrain their emotions more than others. And so Adam Grant was not wholly accepting of everything that Merve Emre said, because obviously he's done a lot of work with organizations, and he absolutely buys into this idea of, I think, to pacify Merve would be to say the EQ rather than EI, because the intelligence has this sort of cachet about it. But Adam agreed to an extent because he was saying that, so there's an example of a very, very old experiment. I think it was done in the 1950s by Walter Mischel. And I don't know if you've heard of it, the marshmallow study, and it was with little kids.
Yeah.
And they are given a marshmallow, and I'm sure it's been replicated hundreds of times. They're giving a marshmallow and they're told, if you wait for 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow, we'll give you another marshmallow. And so one of the tests, and it's equated to an element of emotional intelligence, was the ability to delay gratification. And those who were able to delay gratification had higher SAT results, did better at school, etc., etc. So it was all sort of linked. So see, there you go. People who can delay gratification, people who've got higher emotional intelligence will do better at school. Completely ignoring there was a whole societal element to this, in the fact that the majority of the children, when you look at it, as far as I understand, and I hope I'm not misquoting, the subsequent research into this that only came out several decades after the initial experiment, was that the majority of children who were unable to delay gratification all came from very poor backgrounds and knew poverty. And so they didn't know where their next food was coming from. And so, of course, they were going to eat what there was in front of them rather than wait for a promise of another marshmallow. And so somehow it became this sort of, people with emotional intelligence are better, going to do better. And they seem to be saying that those two things were linked. But actually, the academic performance was linked more than likely to their sociological background, rather than whether or not they were able to withstand eating a marshmallow. And there were lots of other reasons about why they ate the marshmallow that were completely unrelated to whether or not they were emotionally intelligent or had a high EQ. And the same with Goldman's examples in his book, that actually most of the examples he was giving that he was saying were, oh, not emotional intelligence, were actually examples of people who had mental health issues rather than not having emotional intelligence. And so she's really struggling with this idea of, first of all, making it as if it means you're a better person, but also she then goes on in her research to talk about how it's now being co-opted as a corporate control, i.e. that it's used to make people work harder or to work longer or work for free, because then they're like, oh, well, you're not aligned, you're not empathetic to corporate goals. So she's got a view in terms of how it is used to manipulate people, whereas Adam Grant sees it in a very different way and sees a lot of the positives, but recognizes that it can be used, or corporate focus on EQ can be used not for good. So I think that was really what he was saying, is that you can't cure a sick culture just by turning around to everyone and giving them some mindfulness training. There's also organizational elements that aren't going to be cured by the people having good EQ, because it requires everyone in the organization to have a good EQ, particularly the leaders, as we know that leaders leak in the nicest possible way. So I have taken this a little bit down rabbit hole. I completely agree that when you look at the four elements in the way that we look at them, rather than necessarily the way Goldman looked at them, because I'm not convinced that Goldman's analysis of EI is without a flaw. And I think that really all Adam was recognizing was that we can use these concepts for however we want to look at them. If I look at, am I self-aware? I think I'd say, yeah, I'm pretty self-aware. Can I read other people's emotions? Yeah, I'm pretty good at that. Can I use emotions to improve my own thinking? Yeah, I reckon I can do that. Managing my own emotions and managing the emotions of others, I think probably is the place where I don't do so well. And I think if you approach it in that way, in terms of the self-reflection piece, then absolutely I'm all on board. But I just wanted to chuck it, just let's be clear about, there's also the potential for manipulation by leaders and organizations.
And I think I will go away and listen to it. And I'm also sat here thinking it's quite interesting, somebody's take on it in terms of where their EQ takes them. Because I did go and do a freebie EQ test, and I came out as the optimist, which I think puts me in a very different camp potentially from somebody who sees emotional intelligence being used in a manipulative way. And I'm not disagreeing that it can be. I don't think it is the overarching thing. Springs to mind from my perspective, especially working as a leader. And I'm a bit like you. I can have leaky emotions on a regular basis and do hold myself to a reasonably high standard in terms of reading people, being interested in trying to understand people with conflict. I actually work better at keeping my emotions in check the more difficult the situation. So landing me in hospitality during COVID, I was like, yeah, I can do this. But little pernickety things like trying to sort out a DHL return this morning nearly made me bust a blood vessel, which is ridiculous. So that when the crunch time comes, I can actually do it really, really well. Whereas it's the day-to-day things where I have to manage it. I'm not going to disagree with her, because I think that I would also use the word coercive, where you can be in a good emotional state and not necessarily using it for the best good for others and for an organization. I think you can, that element of playing on people's emotions. And I think that when we think about hearts and minds or trying to convince an organization to do things, I mean, we've talked to other people about this, about the disconnect between what an organization might say about themselves and what's actually happening under the surface. And where does EQ come into play with that? But the piece that I was reading about Daniel Goleman, where he was talking about, the TED talk that I listened to about managing emotions, was about there being no correlation between IQ and EQ. So I think that was the path that I went down, that you can leave it to one, not exactly leave it to one side, because there was somebody else I listened to as well. I'll have to get the name back. But the distinctions between IQ, personality, and EQ and how they all play together. But, I jokingly said about the state of flow that we're in. And this TED talk that Daniel Goleman is giving is about how do you have people in a state of flow. And it's quite interesting when I've looked back at what I wrote down, because I think it can play in both ways. It can play for progression and it could play for coercion, which are clear goals and flexibility to attain them. Because the coercion piece comes with, well, that means that you haven't really got the flexibility piece, or you're only giving enough flexibility to fit with your own parameters, not necessarily for the human beings interacting with it. Immediate feedback on progress. That I find progressive and quite positive, in terms of if that's going to help people be in a state of flow, rather than bloody appraisal systems waiting for a year's time to actually tell them, saying to people right there and then how they're doing, because you give them that boost to go and do more. But again, you could be being quite manipulative, I guess, with that. Challenging and growing skill set, that stretch. Again, I think you are very much with your own EQ playing into somebody else's, because you know these people well enough to go, I think you can do X and I'm going to stretch you a little bit so that you end up doing Y. And then matching ability with tasks to improve engagement. So again, that's about knowing the people. So if I go all the way back to that mirror neuron element and that mirroring other people's, for me, with people with a good, solid emotional quotient, they are as capable of understanding their own and what they're doing with it as they can in spotting it in others. And then using them both for a better outcome.
Well, I think that's where the issue is, isn't it? Because Adam Grant podcast, actually, I think on his podcast, he was obviously taking a break and he featured another podcast called No Stupid Questions with Angela Duckworth and Stephen Dubner. So I think she's a psychologist and he's a journalist. And the question for that episode was, how important is emotional intelligence? And they have a conversation that's a lot less confrontational and go into the background. So they talk about Salovi, she talks about the Mesquite tests, but then they go on and talk about the manipulation piece that Adam Grant has talked about in other pieces of work. So they put forward two hypotheses, I guess. One was you can still be a good leader without high EQ, and then gave examples of Steve Jobs, who's the Facebook bloke, and who's the Amazon bloke,
Oh, Zuckerberg.
Yes, and blah, 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 blah.
Oh, Menno brain has kicked
Anyway, someone will tell
in.
us. But him, he's the... Yeah, I'm not... She won't say anything because it'd probably be libelous, slanderous. Anyway, him and the journalist guy was sort of saying, hey, and none of those guys are, on the face of it, are particularly renowned for traits that might be attributed to high EQ, and yet they are very, very successful. And she sort of went on and said, oh, well, I can't possibly speak about what their EQ is because don't know them. But for me, I was thinking, well, this is kind of an interesting little point, isn't it? That they might be organizational leaders, strategic leaders, but they're not people leaders. They're kind of pulling an organization behind them, but not necessarily individuals. And I kind of do struggle sometimes with that difference, that sometimes I see people who are strategic leaders. I see it a lot in the UN. They've got their sort of big ideas coming out of their heads or their behinds, depending on how you approach it or how you think about it, but actually don't give a shit about the people and are not engaging with people at all. And so I kind of have a thing there. But then the other one, Adam Grant's talk about manipulation, was like Hitler had, on the face of it, very high EQ because he could read people, he could persuade people, that eye thing you just talked about, the mirroring. And so he had put forward this thing that leaders who master emotions can, doesn't say do, rob us of our capacity to reason. And that's why there are some very charismatic people. But her point was, and I thought kind of went down to maybe this discussion that Merve also has had, was the EI description doesn't include judgment, it doesn't include morality, and it doesn't include integrity. So you can have high emotional intelligence while being a monumental bastard. Yeah. And so I think for me, the issue is that suggesting that if you've got high EQ, that somehow you are better, having a higher ability to manage your emotions, or having a higher ability to understand other emotions and do something with those emotions, to me doesn't necessarily mean better. It can be, but I don't know it always is.
And I think that when we put it like that, I would now be in agreement, because I'm thinking stories here now where, the people who are out there, running enormous companies, because we don't sit in them, so we don't know what the experience is like for the people within them. You hear anecdotes, good, bad, or indifferent, about those, and then our own experiences in organisations, and indeed other people in other organisations. So you could end up with somebody with pretty low EQ leading an incredibly profitable and excellent organisation. What you have to hope
yeah,
is that they've got some level of awareness to know that they're quite shit on the EQ front, and that they have bought themselves the people in around them who can do that for them. I had a boss in an organisation who would often say, you are here because I don't know how to talk to people. And I remember quite early on going, you cannot be the chief exec in this organisation and not know how to talk to people. I'm going to have to show you how to do it and make you do it. And of course, what I was doing was using my EQ to very much manipulate. If I'm thinking about it now, I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ, here we go. Because I was trying to convince him that he'd got to up his quotient, when in fact, the best thing that I could do was be his spokesperson, make him seem human, because he was human behind closed doors. He just couldn't bear being out in the crowd, making the small talk or whatever. But he had the best interest at heart. So he probably did have high EQ and was an introvert. So there's all of this mashed into the whole thing. And yet, as you're rightly pointing out, there are then people who try to destroy parts of the whole world with very high EQ. So I think it is very much a case of the level of awareness to know the impact that your emotional quotient can have on yourself and others.
I wonder whether there's also, because I do think that if we're going to make emotional intelligence sort of this thing people should aspire to, that maybe the definition should include something like integrity, or, so that not only can you see the impact, but that you also care about the impact. Because just before we were recording, I think we'd talked about the fact we might have come across the same article about this idea about dark empaths, people who have the triad of behaviors or traits that are not necessarily good for society in terms of psychopathy, psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and apparently sadism can be added in to make it the dark tetra.
Excellent.
Awesome. And that generally it had been understood that people who had high levels of these traits generally didn't show high levels of EQ. But that then they'd done some research recently come out. I don't think it's that recent because I think the article's about 4 years old, but had said that they'd found people who actually had high levels of what they might call empathy. So they weren't judging the whole of the EQ quadrant. They were looking at empathy specifically. But what's interesting, and that I think plays into a little bit of recognizing whether your EQ, the empathy within your EQ is for good or for bad. There's two types of empathy. One's kind of cognitive empathy. That's being able to see or read other people's emotions, understand other people's emotions. That's cognitive empathy. And that's the one that you can use to manipulate people. Because the other empathy is where you actually share those feelings. You not only can see them, but you actually can experience them or sympathize as well. And that's affective empathy. And so I think that what they'd found was these, what they're calling now dark empaths, and I'm going to love, I'm sure that will become a massive thing for a while, is that the dark empaths have cognitive empathy but don't have affective empathy. And the triad, or the tetrad, maybe not the tetrad, the triad, are seen in leaders. Like many leaders have elements of psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism in order to succeed. And so they then have this cognitive empathy in order to be able to manipulate as well. So yeah, we're all on the lookout now. I don't know, if people who claim that they can see auras, so looking out for people surrounded by blackness rather than sparkliness.
Well, and I'm not going to be donning my cloak and starting to take a look at people's auras, but I think because I don't think that that's in my skill set. And I do think that when I find leaders with a willingness to tell stories about unpleasantness, discomfort, making themselves vulnerable, if I was able to see an aura, I'd say it wasn't black. And I came across a TED talk by Dr. Joan Rosenberg, and she's talking about the gifted wisdom of unpleasant feelings. And I think that this is something that enables your emotional quotient. And she's definitely saying the same. And it'd be quite interesting to sort of like then align this with what we're talking about, narcissists, etc. Because she talks about 8 unpleasant feelings. I'm sure we could add to the list, but she talks about sadness, shame, helplessness, anger, vulnerability, embarrassment, disappointment, and frustration. And what she's talking about in terms of practicing to fill up your EQ, to expand it, is to be able to get to a place of empowered patience. I love that, empowered patience with discomfort, rather than seeing it as bad or negative, but realizing that it is temporary and navigable. And she says that in actual fact, whenever you get a gut punch of some description, somebody criticizing you or whatever it might be, that in actual fact, if you can ride the wave of, this goes to this 400 emotional experiences in a day, the wave is only 60 to 90 seconds long. She says it's half a song, for Christ's sake. So when we spend our lives trying to escape from uncomfortable feelings, that's how long it should take to resettle and realize that it's temporary and something else happens without it actually taking root. So that you can, and the fact is that if you can do it, when the memory comes back, you might have the feeling again, but you know how to ride the wave. Now, when I correlate that to a narcissist or a psychopath, from the cognitive bit that you're talking about, what they have done is completely bypassed unpleasant feelings. There is a way for them, and again, I don't know the science behind this, but my sense is that there is a way for them to compartmentalize things. And just to sort of like close this out, and then I'll shut up so that you can say something, is that I had a boss who could be really quite vicious in their way of saying things to you. It's been a while since I've been made to cry and work, but they managed to do it. It's more recent than I'd care to remember. And yet I know, because somebody else told me this, that they would say, I can be quite harsh, but I compartmentalize it. It's gone. Once I've said it, it's gone. And this person was telling me that that was the way that they described it. I said, well, it might have been fucking gone for them, but it hasn't
Yeah.
been for me. And I think that that's what we're talking
Yeah.
about here, this business about, it doesn't touch them.
And I guess that's going back to, much as I had sort of raised a couple of naysayers or just challenges to some of the received wisdom, I completely can recognize those four, whether they're Goldman's or whether they're Salovi, then, that idea of recognizing the impact, and it would sound as if that particular boss wasn't capable or willing, maybe if they're compartmentalizing it, not willing to be aware of the impact of their emotions. And one of the interesting things that I really love about this idea of EQ is that whereas they say that IQ remains fairly stable throughout your lifetime, is EQ, because of neuroplasticity, we can get better. Like, everybody can get better if they want to, I guess. I guess the self-awareness piece is the hardest one, I would imagine. You can't know what you don't know.
It's very difficult to get into any of the other boxes if you're not aware of self first.
And I wonder how then, so being able to do that, and I'm not even entirely sure how you would improve your self-awareness, but once you've got over that hurdle, then I think that the rest of them are completely doable with work, with support, all of those things. Being able to manage relationships, and we've talked lots about it, managing conflict, listening calmly, how you communicate, social awareness, sort of having more empathy and focusing, because that's just a focus thing, isn't it? Starting to think about, how would someone else feel? How would I feel if these were reversed? And your management, I've talked about how I leak my emotions. I'm going to have to find another way of describing it because it just sounds weird. But I do think within, I guess one of the elements is how you apply all of these things, is that, you might be able to manage your emotions, but sometimes it's okay to get angry. Sometimes there are situations that require you to be absolutely clear about how you're feeling rather than reining them in.
Sure.
And of course, there are other situations. And it's more about that you, one, recognize which situations are the right situations, and also that you can. And I think that, sometimes I've been in situations where I have struggled with being able to, in a situation where I really need to keep my emotions in check. And I don't quite like that, maybe that description, but that's what I'm going to use because that's the only words I can think of at the moment. But to be able to just hold it in and be able to continue to be calm, whereas other times, just let rip, and people need to know you're angry about stuff sometimes.
Exactly. And I think that in the learning the self-awareness and then the self-management, the control bouncing back bit, that I will often help people that swallow back things. And this is my own experience as well, because you think you are going to let rip in such a way that you may well commit murder, or that you'll say something, okay, that's maybe a little bit extreme, or that you'll say something that you'll really regret. So you end up swallowing it back and then never saying it. And my experience and my practice for self, and one that I invite others to consider, is that when you have re-regulated, this business about still having the memory of what it feels like is to go back and let people know how they made you feel, or how you felt in that moment. So that, starting with that, I've reflected on this and I really feel the need to say X. And it's taken the sting out of it, but it's made your emotion worthy rather than it just being stuffed away and not handled. Because we've been looking quite a lot, and more recently talking to people who have had great experience of working with our Gen Zers, etc. now. I found a TED talk by a lad called Maximilian Park, and he's talking about emotional intelligence from the teenage perspective, which is brilliant. But what was in it was like, okay, he's talking about it from a teenage perspective, and yet I can still see this being my experience now. So it's almost like, which part of yourself, Bob, are you bringing to play when you're dealing with your emotions? And I think I've said in other things, when we were talking about criticism, that I often end up as my teenage self. Because Maximilian was talking about, when it comes to a situation like this, we often tend to catastrophize. And one of the rationales that he sees in his teenage brain of the reason for that is that, bizarrely, it's safer to do it like that because it doesn't give you false hope.
Interesting.
I thought that was like, oh my God, is that what I do? So, I'll catastrophize something. So when it, of course, never ends up to be the hideous scenario that I've created for myself, and it's that much better, I can go, oh, okay, that was all right then. Rather than actually sort of like leading with this element about it could be okay. So then I map that back into what Dr. Joan Rosenberg is saying about, ride the wave, because riding the wave will stop you from catastrophizing. And then the other guy I found was Travis Bradberry, who talks about the 3 silver bullets around attitude for gratitude, improving sleep hygiene, which was extraordinarily interestingly, and reducing caffeine. And
as long as it doesn't talk about reducing alcohol, we're all right.
Exactly. Well, that comes back to sleep hygiene and how much red wine before you go to bed, etc. But going back to the teenage perspective, whereas Adam Grant is going, you can't teach everybody mindfulness, etc., to help them regulate their emotions. Maximilian is asking for exactly that, to actually help people in early years to be practicing ways of self-awareness, practicing ways of self-management, to actually get them geared up for being in a world of work. So it brings it almost full circle with what the younger generation are asking us to put a focus on for how they can actually be better for themselves.
Yeah. I don't think Adam Grant was saying quite how you've heard.
Okay.
What he was saying was that if you've got an organizational issue, you can't tell the people who are in that organization to get better at EQ and to help them get better at EQ. Okay. That's a band-aid when actually there are things you need to do in the organization. So I don't think he was suggesting that at all, because I think he's very much an advocate. And, a lot of his work is about helping leaders, helping teams increase and work with their EQ. But he was simply saying that you can't just turn around and go, oh, there's a problem, we'll just tell everyone to improve their EQ, rather than firing bad bosses, rather than holding bad bosses to accountable, rather than getting rid of some of the organizational elements that are actually making people's work stressful. So
got it. So Adam, if you're listening, if only, I'm very sorry for having not actively listened correctly.
Although it's probably my explanation.
In which case, I think Maximilian was of the same ilk. That whole level of support us to be better in regulating ourselves for the future. And I loved it because he says, "Be interested, not interesting." And he was talking about his own personal experience. It was really good. I enjoyed listening.
Well, I all of that you've just said, and this idea of riding a wave, I think actually is really helpful. So I'm definitely going to have to be listening to both of those. And also this idea that it's temporary. I think that there's quite a lot of the CBRT, cognitive-based resilience training, also looks at this idea of just remember it's temporary. Just remember it's temporary. This is not forever. And as you say, I do like that idea of catastrophizing, because I tend not to, although I know other people who do. I don't know that I'd noticed you as a catastrophizer, but especially because you're an optimist generally, as you just said, that,
I am, but it's all joking aside, it is a practice. I mean, if you talk to some of my family, there are times, and all joking aside, I think it does go back to this improving sleep hygiene. If I'm tired. So I remember very distinctly, and I was quite young, I'd been away at an athletics meeting for the day with my dad. We'd been on the coach with the rest of the team, and we were due to come back into Ipswich and be collected by my mum and my little brother. And they didn't turn up, and somebody else arrived to say that they were in A&E because they'd had a car crash. Now, thankfully, they were both all right. But if anybody is late when I am expecting them, that still lives in my body, even now. And I can get really het up, which is why my whole family have to put up with me having them on Life 360 and find my phone and all the rest of it, so I know where they are. Yeah. Because I have to do something to alleviate that. Because That's a prime example of where I can easily catastrophize because of something that's happened in the past. And I think that's what Joan Rosenberg is talking about you can still have the same memory moment over and over again. And that's 45 years old or something ridiculous.
Not 45,
But it
darling.
can
It must have been like 35 or 30.
if only. But I think that just proves the point of how much these things can keep coming back. So I guess optimistically, I'm really, really good at doing that at work. I am less good, and that's my practice for when I am out of work. For myself, for my family, but for myself, I can really get myself into a
Pickle.
heap of crap very quickly if I'm not careful. But there it is. And I think that's back to the situational, that your emotional quotient can show up differently in different environments and different situations.
Well,
What? That was amazing. Sorry if everybody else thought it was shit. But I really enjoyed
what? Giving yourself a good pat on the back there, Bobby, aren't you?
Not necessarily me, but us. But sometimes I'll have some idea as to how I think the conversation is going to go. This one, I mean, it's such a massive
We may
subject.
have to revisit.
We could come back to it again and again.
Well, Adam Grant, if you're listening, we'd love you as a guest on the podcast for another episode on EQ, EI, however we want to describe it. And you can maybe give us a bit more information about some of the received wisdom and the challenges to received wisdom on emotional intelligence. Have you got a quote, Bobby?
I have, there's a few flying around here. What one do I give you that I think actually fits with, I'm going to be naughty, I'm going to give two, because there is the one that I think really plays to all the things that we've been talking to today. But it goes, just like children, emotions heal when they are heard and validated.
Nice.
And then the other one, which I think plays to regulation, so this might be just for us too in this first instance, is be master of your petty annoyances and conserve your energies for the big worthwhile things. It isn't the mountain ahead that wears you out. It's the grain of sand in your shoe.
Yes, and not having 12 themes when it says so in a bloody title.
I think with what I've just told you, I'm going to put that up on my wall somewhere as well.
Thanks, Bobby, as ever.
Thank you so much, as always.
See you
soon. Thanks for listening. All the resources mentioned can be found on our website and on our Spotify page. Take a look at your leisure. They also help us sound a little more understandable, believe it or not. Next week, we are joined by Deborah Corey, referred to by others as a culture ninja. Cannot wait to be chatting to her about all things employee experience. So join us then for being the ABC in a positive culture.